Hi, I'm the director for Common Knowledge Trust. We're a New Zealand NGO, and we house Birthing Better Childbirth Preparation skills. And I asked Nicette whether our NGO could do a series for her wonderful VBAC education project, and this is part of it. So today in part 4, we're going to talk about when and how and who developed the Birthing Better skills and why it happened in the context of what was happening in childbirth. I was fortunate enough to give birth in 1970 when the first mistake was made and the huge success was there. I then started to develop these skills in the early 1970s with hundreds of mothers and fathers, and then they continued to develop until the end of the 1980s, and I gave birth last when the first mistake had been made, the success was there, and then something changed in the conversation, which led to what's happened in childbirth since the 1980s to today, and how you're impacted by it. And the success was lost. So I want to talk to you about the context of that, because it's important for you to know your sons and daughters are going to grow up. What are you going to tell them to do? What my generation told our sons and daughters only got across partway because the general conversation about childbirth had changed. And the second mistake was made that built on the first mistake. So we have to actually go back and understand it. So briefly, the wonderful success was due in the United States, perhaps in Canada. New Zealand had a different history where I live. Australia had a different history. Each country had a different history in the 1970s. In the United States, it was the time of the first childbirth preparation classes, and those were Lamaze primarily, taught in every hospital really throughout the 50 states, and Bradley method. So when we got pregnant back then, there was a very high societal expectation that we go to childbirth preparation classes. And we went to Lamaze classes and Bradley classes, and they were 100% skills based. We didn't have any choices like you have today, and we just followed the doctor's orders. But we became skilled, and from the 60s to the mid 70s, multiple millions of women and men in the United States were becoming skilled and taking those skills into hospital births with labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians, with all sorts of assessments, monitoring procedures, with no choices. And we used our skills. And this had a huge positive impact on the labor and delivery nurses and the obstetricians when over a generation, multiple millions of mothers and fathers just being able to come in and help, use skills. They weren't the greatest skills, but they were something, which meant that women were no longer suffering as much as they had in the past. Doctors and labor and delivery nurses in the United States saw women cope and manage pretty well. So we talked about our births when we gave birth to our sons and daughters as that we coped or managed pretty well, or the breathing skills weren't as good as we thought, or it was really hard to relax, but we kept trying, and we had a partner who really helped us when we needed to. That's what we talked about, because we had no choices. We didn't talk about what you guys are talking about. We didn't have any expectations. We used our skills working with and around all the assessments, monitoring, and procedures. So what was the big mistake if there was a huge success, right? And the big mistake was that Lamaze and Bradley, and New Zealand, it was Grantley Dick Reed, were saying that their skills were ideal for women having low-risk pregnancies and childbirth. And that was the first time that the word normal got defined as low risk. It never was before. Before, it was anything that happened at birth could happen. That was normal and natural. When you take away medicine, all risks, 100% of pregnant women give birth. risk or no risk. So these three obstetricians were seeing the medicalization of birth, and they began to separate out low risk from high risk. Why is that? And that you can go back to part one and part two and discover that more. So what happened was that even though everybody in the US was learning these skills, the philosophy was that it was for low risk women, for natural births, pain-free labors, with no medical assessments, monitoring procedures, because those things had not been called interventions then. Those didn't get called interventions until the 80s. So we had those things. We didn't have a choice, and we used our skills. But many of us didn't use the skills well because we weren't low risk, or when our births became more complex, we stopped using them. So those skills weren't designed for everybody, but 100% of pregnant women give birth. So in fact, we want skills that work for everybody. And that's where Birthing Better skills started to develop. And they equally developed by fathers and mothers because men were seeing birth really for the first time, and they were expected to do something to coach, to help women cope and manage and feel more in control. And women wanted them to. Why? Because previous to that, we were left alone and we lacked skills. So when you lack skills and you're left alone, something profound happens. Okay? One is, if you don't have skills, it's overwhelming. Birth can be overwhelming. It's a very, very big experience. But if you're left alone, the fact is you've got to cope. So either you freak out the whole time or you get your act together. But that's inventing as you go. It's not having learned beforehand and practiced and then committed to using your skills to feel in control. And that's why so many women suffered in childbirth. So when fathers came in, they came in because women wanted them to help us. But we didn't know how to help ourselves. And that's why Lamaze and Bradley was so profound. At least we had some skills finally that were universal, except they were tied to these low-risk normal births. So that was the mistake. If these three obstetricians had just said 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, we should all have skills as long as we're conscious, we would be in a different situation now, because my generation would have told our sons and daughters they would have normally and naturally learned skills when they gave birth to you. And you would naturally now be learning skills. But that mistake was made because one is, skills don't guarantee that you have a normal labor or that you have a good outcome. What skills do really primarily is to help women not suffer, help women cope. And they primarily help a birth coach help her to cope and to handle and to deal with, regardless of where she births or who's present or her circumstances or what's happening to her around her. So Birthing Better skills developed because as fathers were coming in, we wanted our husbands or partners or mothers or sisters to know how to help us. And we had to find skills that worked for all of us. So Birthing Better families, equally fathers and mothers, developed these skills and asked me to carry them forward, and I put them into a New Zealand NGO in the mid-1990s. So what did we develop? Well, the cesarean rate in the United States in 1970 was 4.5%. So we weren't trying to do anything other than cope. Everybody was laboring, whether they had risk factors or not. Twins, breeches, preeclampsia. Plus, unless a woman's life was threatened, you labored. It didn't mean that you had a good outcome or that you dealt with it. It could be a terrible experience or, okay, great, but you labored. So at first, Birthing Better families just wanted to develop the skills to cope better, because Lamaze and Bradley relaxation and breathing skills were the first, so they weren't very evolved. They worked for some, they were targeted to a few, and they didn't work for many, and they weren't targeted to the vast majority. So Birthing Better families develop skills, and we develop them from the two viewpoints. I'm going to give birth. The man or woman who is helping me, they're the coach. They have to be able to see and hear how we're coping. And if I lack skills and they lack skills, then there's a belief that there's nothing you can do because there's a global truth. There's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. So therefore, that's followed with, therefore, there's nothing you can really do to prepare for it. That's not true, right? Right? So that's what we learned, and that's what Lamaze and Bradley had learned as well, is you prepare by becoming skilled. And why should you become skilled for this thing that's a one-off and it's infrequent and you don't know what it's going to be like? Because it's an activity, you have to do it, right? And in your life, everything you're doing is an activity that you have skills to. If you're driving to work, it's an activity. You learned how to drive and you learned how to get to work and you learned how to park. If you have a kid and they have to learn to tie their shoelaces or learn to walk or learn to potty train, or if you have hobbies, you have to learn them. You have to use your skills. We have a very high societal expectation that when we get behind the wheel of the car, that we all use our skills at every single second of the moment of time. And birth's like that. It's just a journey in time rather than in space. And you have to have adjustable, adaptable, and sustainable skills. And so that's what Birthing Better Families developed from the 70s until the 80s. We coped better. We coped great. And birth professionals loved working with us because they were so much more relaxed. Right? They enjoyed it more. Why not? It's much more fun to be with somebody who's managing than somebody who's freaking out. But we did notice something, and that was at the same time that the next childbirth mistake was made. So the first mistake that was made was not attributing skills to everybody and for all births, and with a goal of just having women cope and manage better, rather than for a small group of low-risk women with this idea they wouldn't experience any medical care and that they would have good outcomes and cope well. So that's a limited goal: natural birth, pain-free labor. Pain-free labor. Okay, I've been with some women who have pain-free labors. Tiny number. Okay, so the fact is that first mistake colored everything, because not enough women who were trying to do that actually achieved it, because you never know what your birth's going to be like. If a woman is freaked out, the medical profession wants to save her by doing things. And if she has an issue that becomes a problem, the medical profession wants to do things to stop the problem, right? That's why we like modern medicine. We don't want to go back into the villages where they don't have it. We expect modern medicine to reduce risks. So that's why they do it. It's not that they're out to get us. It's that we demand it of modern society, and we have to own up to that. So in the 70s and 80s, we had better skills, and we still had often a long first or second stage, which meant we had more assessments, monitoring, and procedures. And so as the childbirth trend was changing, we began to focus differently and to focus on preparing our body. So when women in the first trend, first mistake, weren't achieving those natural births by using skills, the next thinking was skills don't work to achieve that. So what would work to achieve those natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care? And that's choice, and that's where we are now. So it was supposed to be, you know what kind of birth you want. So you just need to tell them what kind of birth you want, and they're supposed to give it to you. So what happened was the childbirth preparation classes that were all skills-based became information-based, and there were very few skills. So what happened was between the 70s and when I gave birth in 1982, that half a generation of people stopped using skills, and they hadn't taught any. So they didn't have them, so they didn't use them. Fathers were told not to coach, but to support the choices and to guard the sacred space, which is near impossible. Come on. So what happened was that instead of seeing multiple millions of skilled moms and dads, labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians began to see very few, and that's what it is today, but with a long list of demands, right? So this has gone off the wall, and this is what started to develop. So I'm going to talk about the development later on in part 5. But just to recap this, First mistake that was made was the idea that skills were only for low-risk normal women to achieve a narrow goal of natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical assessment monitoring procedures. That was the first mistake. But in the United States, those skills were taught everywhere. And we went into the hospitals with all the assessments, monitoring procedures, and we used our skills. And our husbands or other used those skills. And we felt proud of our births. That didn't mean we liked it, and it didn't mean we always had a good outcome, and it didn't mean we always liked what they did, or what we had to endure there, or the constraints or the restrictions. But it was because of how we behaved that the whole medical profession around maternity care changed for the positive. Skilled women give people more comfort. They're more relaxed. So instead of having to be in bed, now, in the 80s, you can get up and walk. We couldn't eat. We couldn't drink. Oh my God, we had so many restrictions, and we were empowered because we used skills. So, what are we saying to you? You're pregnant now, use skills. We need to have another high societal expectation that you learn skills, but there aren't going to be any classes. And it's now a global conversation. You have to self-learn them. There are lots of them. Yes, Birthing Better is one of them because we developed them and we're in an NGO that houses them because mothers and fathers wanted you to have them down the road. But there's Lamaze, there's Bradley, there's Grantley Dick Reed, there's hypnobirthing, there's hypnobabies, there's calm birth, birthing within. There are other skills-based methods, but don't confuse an information course with one that gives you skills. You want skills, 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 because the information is going to fly out your brain and you have to do the activity. So you need skills. So in part 5, I'm going to talk about the development of how we start to prepare our body. So in the complete course, you get all the coping stuff and how to prepare your body, and then all the other adjunct skills. We have split that course up into 3 short courses. So you can choose to just learn about the body skills that I'll talk about next, or the coping skills, or the adjunct skills that tie it together. And we have a VBAC course now, because remember, the cesarean rate was 4.5%. And yet, we were the generation of women who were the first ones to want to have a VBAC. And that's also part of why we started to evolve how to prepare our body for childbirth. So I probably don't have much else to say right now. So I'm going to go away and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.